once it loads. Excellent. Okay, welcome everybody to this first round of New Zealand Nationals for 2020. On the affirming team in this round, we have Central North Island, and on the negating team, we have Auckland. We have Auckland White. So without further ado, I'd like to invite. Excellent. Okay, welcome everybody to this first crazy. Round of. Okay, all sorted. So without further ado, I'd like to invite up the first speaker of the affirmative team. Welcome them.
Thank you. I'll just take POIs vocally as they're offered as well. Thanks. New Zealand's dairy farming industry operates under a veneer of New Zealand's economic saviour that actually deteriorates the national environment, shackles New Zealand's sanitation, and grips the economy in a deadlock of unpredictable reliance due to the dairy farming's monopoly that it has over New Zealand. Side proposition is the only side of the House that recognises New Zealand's future in the improvement of the economy and the environment, which are two incredibly significant beneficiaries in the long term that must be held in strong rapport to strengthen New Zealand's future. What are our definitions in this debate today? We see the dairy herd as being the cows specifically used for dairy production, which we also recognise as one of the largest proportion of cows in New Zealand used for this sort of industry. What's our model for dealing with this? What we do is we implement a gradual cull for cows over a multiple year period while we're allowing increasingly phasing more culling of cows over the years to give farmers adequate response time in order to prepare. What we do is we provide a subsidy as a proportionate to the amount of cows culled to allow them also to sell this meat as they see fit from these cows culled to support the farming industry as much as we can. We'd use this subsidy as incentivization to encourage this cull, and we think this is an incredibly large act that would encourage people to cull cows. In the case that this wouldn't happen, we'd legally enforce it. When we're looking at a significant proportion, we're looking at about 40 to 50% of New Zealand's dairy herd. And what we do is we'd ask these dairy farms that maybe some are no longer going to be producing these dairy herds, while other dairy farms are going to be producing significantly less. What are our arguments in this debate today? Three things we're bringing. First of all, the impacts on the environment. Secondly, the diversification of the economic industry. And Mel will be bringing you a split at second on the effect on farmers. Let's look at this first point, the environment. So now more than ever, we're facing an unprecedented and unreturnable stance towards global warming. We've got significant harms, particularly within New Zealand, with the incredible volatile climate conditions, and yet we're relying on an industry that is actively contributing to New Zealand's carbon footprint and exponentially constructing it. Through mass dairy herds, these cows are producing significant high levels of methane and carbon dioxide, which are contributing to these greenhouse gases, ultimately doing detriment to the Earth's temperature. So we're going to look at this in sort of two main outcomes of why you get significant harms in a practical and diplomatic effect. So on a practical point, when we're specifically looking at the harms of these, when you have these increased temperatures leading to significant sea level rise, we think particularly as in the actual New Zealand, we've got significant harms to our island neighbours and our coastal regions within New Zealand. We think it's a really important that we acknowledge that even though New Zealand is unlikely to probably reduce global climate change, if we can significantly reduce our footprint, we're still getting incredibly beneficious material under our side of the house that will have significant effect on New Zealand's national level, and not just later how you get significant gains in the international community as well. So what are these material gains? When you get a lower carbon footprint, you're reducing the chance of random weather events in New Zealand, where we've seen this happen with major Northland floods and droughts, where this has fluctuated drastically. Earlier in this year, major floods in the South Island that have been scientifically linked from New Zealand's carbon footprint have led to incredibly volatile impacts on rural economies and industries within this area. We think it's incredibly harmful to perpetuate this sort of destruction, and that actually that domestic levels of sanitation and water that you're getting from dairy industry has a significant harm to the people and the farming industries that relies upon these sort of areas that are being detrimented by these things. Because when you get stable weather, more stable weather, you've got a huge impact on all sectors of New Zealand, including the farming industry, rather than having its mutual destruction.
On that point?
So, yes, I'll take a point.
Okay, so you say on your side you stand for the environment, but how does your policy not significantly harm the global environment when instead of, the efficient and environmentally friendly production in New Zealand, you get production in environmentally unregulated places like Brazil?
We don't think in New Zealand we're going to get unregulated economies and production. Actually, what we're doing is we're recognising that New Zealand's dairy herd industry is significantly damaging and harmful to New Zealand's economy to New Zealand's environment, and therefore we're mitigating the risk of all of these harms that I've outlined happening, actually doing benefit to our economy. So even if we look at the impacts on the environment, here's why even if we achieve marginal benefits to the environment, here's why this is still important. So if we look at the context of diplomacy, we think it sends a really incredibly important message to the international community that New Zealand is taking accountability and action towards sustainability, actively working towards a solution rather than focusing and mongering on a problem. Because we think it's incredibly demeaning for New Zealand to stand as a partner of the vulnerable Pacific Islands where we're actively producing a huge majority of their destruction. We need to acknowledge that New Zealand is probably unlikely to stop climate change, but if we can herald to the international community that we're standing by our image of being clean and green, and that we actually want a solution to this problem, we're bringing significant positive change and receptors to other developing nations as well, who can actually see this as inspiration in order to see that we don't have to cripple the economy in order to provide sustainability. What are our impacts of this? Because when you create a physically better environment and still present a really strong and important image of sustainability, you get a really important thing, you send a really clear message to the whole world, which is actually a huge actor of New Zealand's tourism. We see a lot of people coming into New Zealand because of their clean and green promotion, and you set a clear precedent to other nations that this actually can be achieved, because what we're doing is we're not compromising the economy for the environment, we're allowing these to grow mutually together in order for their conjunctivity and their mutual increasing and their of their benefits. So let's look at the second point, the diversification of industries in New Zealand. So currently as it stands, New Zealand has an incredibly huge reliance upon the dairy industries. It's almost not New Zealand's exports. Now what happens is this is incredibly dangerous because New Zealand is a really small player within the international economic market. There are far bigger players that influence the world price, which New Zealand has no say on, and even like places such as India, which are the largest sort of suppliers of milk, we're incredibly at risk towards the world price levels and outcome. So it's really, really damaging for a country as small as New Zealand to be dependent on this. So in the 1980s, for example, Europe and New Zealand were both subsidising dairy, but when this was removed, the subsidisation of dairy by the government, we basically essentially created depression within New Zealand due to the reliance that dairy has on our industry. And we think this is really dangerous to be able to say that we are going to rely upon this. So what we're doing is when we're taking away this dairy industry, which is no longer going to become a significant part of our economy, we're allowing for different areas and people in dairy farming industry to diversify and branch into different industries, because this is no longer incentivized to act in this sort of industry. We're transforming and allowing people to grow into different niche markets. And we think it's also important to mention that it's incredibly actually easy and through the money gained through our side of the house to actually gain traction into different sort of farming initiatives as well. Because when you're going to get this diversification, you're allowing for more stability and less economic dependency on volatile markets. We're building a broader economic base by filtering through different markets and creating an image that still shows New Zealand's rich environmental environment while building our economic capital in a sustainable and productive route. Because we're preserving this image and we're allowing for the New Zealand to uphold its economy and the people it represents. Because on our side of the house, we're not compromising the environment for the economy. We're allowing them to grow in conjunction sustainably. So proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the first speaker of the negative team.
Can you hear me? I just, for POIs, if you could just also do it audibly, that would be great. Madam Speaker, when a dairy farming family is forced, even over time, to cull half of their herd, this family is completely destroyed. They are unable to sell their milk at a competitive price. They cannot look after the animals they still have left, and they cannot provide secure job prospects for the next generation. What AF are going to do on their side of the house is take away an industry that is integral to so many New Zealanders. So what do we prove to you today? Two things. Firstly, that rural communities are going to be completely decimated. And secondly, that the global environment is going to be worse if this motion is pushed through. And we can win on either of these points as they're both important to New Zealand. But what do we specifically stand for? We stand for continued environmental and animal rights legislation, expanding what already exists in New Zealand, and for New Zealand continuing to act as a global leader in dairy and pushing this innovation to occur, for example, investing in GM grass or research for waterway protection and promoting this to other countries as well. So 3 main points for the House today. Firstly, why is this incredibly negative for rural communities? Secondly, how is it going to harm the global environment? And thirdly, Millie will split about the long-term political ramifications. A couple of points first that AF wants to bring us. So one of the key aspects of their case is how this is going to be very negative for the environment. Most of my rebuttal on this point will be integrated directly into my point about the environment, but let's address 2 other key things first. Firstly, they talked about how existing flooding and environmental impacts from dairy farming mean that dairy farmers are already unable to farm properly and it's having a negative impact on them. And we're glad that they brought this up because firstly, it actually works on our side. There is an existing incentive for farmers to farm more sustainably, and that's going to be way more effective in getting them to engage with this sort of rhetoric rather than forcing a sudden change on them that is going to make them completely against environmental change because they see it as negative to their profit. Secondly, though, they completely failed to respond to our POI about how the global environment is in fact going to be worse because other countries can't implement change. Secondly, though, on this point, they wanted to talk in a very fluffy way about how we're going to send an international message that's going to lead to other people creating change. And we simply tell you that signaling does not work. For instance, we're not in government looking at New Zealand being such a world leader in dairy farming sustainability and then deciding to change their own industry at the cost of their own national profit in response. So they simply don't get any practical effect at the end of this point. Secondly, very briefly, they talked about the economy and how New Zealand is such a small player and is going to be at risk by things. We tell you 3 main things here. Firstly, New Zealand is using its competitive advantage like any other country is. At the point where we change our industry, we're going to be more reliant because we don't have the advantage we have with dairy. Secondly, though, taking out dairy is not diversifying. If the regions could diversify, they would do that already because they understand risk. They gave us no understanding for what dairy farmers could do instead in order to propose their industry. So on to my first main point about how this is going to decimate rural communities. And let's have a reality check. At the point where you do this gradual policy, you are still going to completely wipe out dairy. Even if they argue that this is going to give time for adjustment, dairy farming fundamentally relies on economies of scale. The only reason that transport costs, that equipment, that processing plants are affordable at the moment is because of the significant number of people who are using them and investing in them. And at the point where you even halve the dairy industry, these things are going to be more expensive. That means that farmers make less profit. They can't sell on their milk to Fonterra at a competitive rate. So what do we see at this point? We are taking away the largest industry that props up the community and the culture of such a significant proportion of New Zealanders. And that's just insane. So two main reasons about why this is going to have such negative impacts. Firstly, even if you give people time to adjust, as they wanted to say in their model, it's really not feasible for farmers to, in the long-term, transition. If they can sell their meat, like they wanted to say, and make a short-term profit of that, that is not a sustainable way of making income. But why is it so hard to transition? We see two key things here. Firstly, that the equipment used is super expensive. And secondly, that the expertise that has been gathered in dairy farming over such a long time is simply not transferable. It's really different if you're like artificially inseminating a cow and trying to look after some wheat. And if they want to tell us that they're going to stand for like sheep and beef farming and the like, they simply can't do that because it has the same environmental effects. They have to stand for a significant change to what our farming is going to look like. So what do these farmers end up with? A lot of land that they probably can't build on and be part of an urban community, and land that has absolutely no economic value to them. Secondly, though, we simply see that the future of these communities is going to be destroyed. At the point where you have young people growing up in rural communities and seeing that there probably aren't safe job prospects in those areas, these people are going to move to places like Wellington and places like Auckland, and the regions are going to be left with people who don't have job prospects otherwise, who probably don't have significant training, and who will be systematically underserved by the government as they are already. What we saw when manufacturing left Northland was a significant increase in drug usage, in poverty. We don't want that to be the fate for all of regional New Zealand. And even if AFCN tell us that they are going to give these people some support, fundamentally they are taking away a significant chunk of GDP, and there is no way that New Zealand can replace that with another industry because we have such ideal area for dairy farming, and that's crucial in why we win this debate. Secondly, though, let's have a look at how we in fact harm the global environment so much more on our side. And this is a crucial part of our case because it's basically what AF's argument really hinges on. But let's take a look then at why global demand for dairy is largely inelastic. This is for two main reasons. Firstly, people understand that dairy is a crucial part of a healthy diet. That's something that they're told like throughout their whole lives, even from school. And we think that unless these people are like urban, wealthy, and have the chance to become vegan and get access and afford all sorts of food substitutes, they probably don't have any other way to get the calcium that they need to get from dairy. Secondly, though, dairy is a massive cultural thing. If you look at the popularity of like bubble tea in China and even here in New Zealand at the moment, we see that people's traditions are largely unchanging. They're going to continue to consume what they were raised to consume, even if that increases in price a little bit because production goes down. And this is particularly key because the alternatives are even more expensive and thus people wouldn't change their mind. So what does this actually mean? If demand is constant, if supply goes down, then supply will need to be found from somewhere else. Where is this going to be? We're looking at places like India, parts of Africa, and Australia, upping their dairy industry. But there's three key reasons why this is always going to be worse for the environment. Firstly, they're not as efficient as New Zealand. We have ideal conditions, we have massive expertise in places like Lincoln University. So other countries are going to have a lower profit margin for dairy and unable to invest sustainably. Secondly, we get greater regulations here in New Zealand because the dairy sector is so large here. There is a significant impetus to be able to regulate, and people are voting with a clean green image in mind that is going to lead them to vote broadly for parties that are more likely to have significant dairy regulations. Thirdly, New Zealand has better science, and this is something we've accumulated over time. So what do we see? Dairy is inherently unsustainable. We are the only side of the house that gets it produced in a sustainable way while helping rural communities, proud to negate.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the second speaker of the affirmative team.
Hi, sorry, just setting up my papers. I will take POIs as they're offered. Thanks. New Zealand's dairy industry is eating our environment, making our economy dependent and hurting our farmers. The reluctant side neg shows to make this necessary change we wish to implement is exactly what is driving this industry into the ground and everyone who relies upon it as well. The point I will be bringing today is how our side of the house is actually benefiting these dairy farmers. However, before I do this, I'd like to respond to the main arguments that have risen in today's debate. So, firstly, we see largely this idea on the other side of the house that rural lifestyle, rural communities are going to be destroyed. So they say dairy farming, it is irreplaceable. So we actually think, as we've explained on our side, this is not the case. Dairy farming is not an irreplaceable industry. There will still be a demand. So yes, it will continue to happen in the background, but also we're actually giving farmers, as I'll largely be expanding on later, the opportunity through subsidy and time to go into other areas as well as incentive to do so. And because New Zealand markets itself as environmentally friendly, which is where a lot of our appeal comes from to other countries, see Manuka honey, which is generally very profitable in China, we see ourselves actually becoming even more successful and having a wider industry that will appeal to a wider market while still making up for a large percentage of dairy, but without the same harsh environmental effect. The demand remains. People do need milk, as they've also stated on their side of the house, despite contradicting this earlier on, which means that that will still be a profitable industry. It's just that we currently see oversaturation, we currently see environmental harms. And if we don't have this over-saturated environment, but we still have this demand, that means that people can actually push the price up if they choose to remain in dairy, which is ultimately more profitable for them. They also said that it's not sustainable because a lot of the skills that you get from dairy farming are non-transferable. Because we're giving people the opportunity by offering a subsidy and incentivizing them to go into other areas such as foresting, which dramatically reduces CO2, or honey, or even quinoa. New Zealand has a quinoa farm now, which are really getting a lot of profits from that. We're actually giving them the opportunity to look into other areas. And we do actually believe a lot of farming skills are very transferable and do dabble. It also means that they're saying that rural communities will die completely flat out. That is contingent on their previous arguments, which I've just proven. On our side, we're also actually going to have rural communities prosper because there's going to be more opportunities, more incentive to go into farming because it's not just your standard dairy farming, and it will have more sustainable and better use of land. So yeah, they say that we have no stability on our side. However, we've proven that this is clearly not the case.
On that,
on their side of the house, that they do have actual incentive to be environmentally sustainable, which we don't actually see any mechanisms or real explanations for. But on our side of the house, we are literally pushing people towards going to more environmentally friendly industries by the government is literally saying you're not environmentally friendly, do something else, but also because that is what New Zealand markets itself as, and that is part of the reason we're so profitable. They also said that our whole international message idea, they said that signaling is fluffy and we won't be seen as virtuous. So actually for our side of the house, we become a bigger player on a global scale because our economy is better, because our economy is more diversified and therefore more relied upon, more people are likely to tap into it and want our products. So we actually do think this is a possibility. And even if it doesn't happen to as large a scale as we wish it to, we still achieve a lot of benefits on our side of the house that they don't. So continuing, I think that might be it. All right, so moving on to my argument. Look, quickly, one response to POI, they said that an issue with dairy farming is that it continues unregulated in other places. Not only do we have international signaling on our side of the house, we are doing our part, which is what is most important, because New Zealand still significantly contributes
on that point.
issues, and it is important that we get rid of that in the first place. We play a large part in creating CO2 emissions. So moving on to my point, how outside of the house benefits the affected farmers. In this point, I will be showing how dairy farmers are affected on outside of the house and why outside is better for this. So firstly, what do people working in the dairy industry look like? Why are they working in the dairy industry? So the dairy industry is massive, both sides of the house understand this. It is an easy default for many people to, because of it being a generational job, hold on a second, parents transfer skills down to children. B, it's an accessible way to maintain a rural lifestyle, which some New Zealanders prefer, and C, a large part of our culture, as we often see in media. Yes?
Okay, so your side's loving to talk about this international signalling, but what incentive is there acting on a leader like Trump, who doesn't even really believe in a lot of these environmental concerns anyway, to listen to this signaling?
Yeah, okay, so actually international signaling isn't the key idea of our argument. The key idea of what happens in New Zealand, that is definitely a benefit that we achieve once we become a bigger player, but I think you're focusing way too much on an argument that isn't very important. Also, we don't necessarily think, like, if Trump decides to, that is completely up to him. That's not the aim of our argument to get Trump independently. I think you're trying to distract me. I'm going to move on. So we see like masses of people working within the dairy industry. It appears reliable. When outside of the houses model is implemented, we see two things happening. One, dairy farmers move into new industries. We see particularly generational dairy farmers who haven't been provided the opportunity, which we're doing for our subsidy and through our gradual push, or the outside opinion, so the government literally saying stop, to diversify farming. So now that we have both of these, the opportunity and being able to less rely on dairy, they will look into other rural industries. So with the government environmental incentive acting upon them. So that means they're likely to look into more interesting and or environmentally friendly industries. We see this in them producing honey or other less destructive New Zealand products that you get filed under premium because of the lack of actual production. So the North Island, as I said earlier, has a really successful quinoa farm. We see more things like that. Because these products tote the sought after environmentally friendly label and are less common, they become luxury goods, which means that more people are willing to go for them. So we see mass production of luxury goods. So on an international scale, that's incredibly profitable. On a local scale, it means more and more people have access to these luxury goods, which is a lifestyle benefit immediately. And they're also bolstering each other and helping each other profit more by internationally marketing environmentally friendly products as top quality. So they earn more, so they have more opportunities for profit, they're profiting more on outside of the house, and they have more opportunities for better lifestyle. The second group is farmers that remain in the dairy industry. People still need dairy, that demand remains. So due to the significantly smaller dairy industry, dairy products can now brand themselves with that same environmentally friendly label, which is profitable. And the dairy industry is less competitive, but the same demand is there. So profits can be set higher, prices can be set higher. So they profit, they have more opportunities overall outside the house. We get all of these benefits. Their side does not. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the second speaker of the negative team.
Speaker, I just want to signal really clearly at the start of my speech that side affirming didn't stand for culling cows. They stood for more investment into rural communities in order to ensure they had greater opportunities. That was where all the material about diversification came from. That was where all the material about having more access to these came from. We told you at first that we were happy to stand for environmental policies and in continued environmental regulation. We see no reason that those training opportunities, those things were at all exclusive to their side of the house. We're happy to claim things like more training into regional communities. We tell you at the point we stand for this and the point we implied we stood for it at first, we tell you we win this debate, all their harms are totally not, the benefits are all non-exclusive. What am I going to do in my speech beyond that? I'm going to prove four things. First of all, I'm going to talk about what happens specifically to regional communities. Second of all, I'm going to talk about the broader economic ramifications in this debate. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about the environmental impacts. And then fourthly, I'm going to talk about bring a substantive contribution around the political ramifications of this motion. First of all, on what happens to regional communities, because they responded to our material that we brought at first by telling you that this is all replaceable and that we can have this kind of stuff. The problem is that dairy isn't replaceable nearly in the same way this happens. How do we see this? We tell you that there's been great investment through the Provincial Growth Fund into training opportunities in rural communities, particularly for children of dairy farmers, to get them into skilled work, to move them to cities, to move them into more, into higher stuff, into higher skill stuff. We tell you this just hasn't resulted in the kinds of shifts away from dairy. That's because New Zealand has a unique comparative advantage in dairy. What does this mean? That means a lot of the land and materials and skills that we have in terms of training people for the dairy industry simply can't be transferred. We tell you that the fact that we have a quinoa farm in the North Island is not indicative of the fact that dairy farmers can go into quinoa, as much as it's indicative of that one piece of land with a couple of people who could train are able to move into quinoa. We tell you that it will require a total overhaul of the kind of land we use, is able to do this. But additionally, we tell you that even if you can switch, those incomes are necessarily going to be really much lower. That's the reason people don't move into poultry when they can have dairy incomes, because the profit margins on those are massively lower. We tell you that means that whether or not people lose all jobs, or if they massively have a reduction in income, you necessarily have the livelihoods of rural communities far less. That means you have people who live in rural communities just spending less in their local communities, engaging less in these kind of communal mechanisms because they have less capacity to engage in their community because they have less income. That's necessarily really bad, because rural communities are already the most vulnerable communities in this country. We should do everything in our power to establish them. Second of all, they told us that we wouldn't destroy dairy altogether, because what was happening is we had too many dairy farms right now. That was briefly, that's totally not true. That responded to none of our material about economies of scale and the fact that dairy production necessarily relies on the fact there's tons and tons of people doing it. We tell you you're probably going to destroy dairy to quite a high degree. I've already responded if that doesn't take the case. We tell you it's silly for them to say we have too much dairy. The fact that global demand exists means that there's we're doing plenty enough. That was dumb. And then briefly, I'd like to signal that if they want to talk about regional communities having more opportunity, we are happy to stand for that kind of investment. Under our side of the house, we're happy to stand for tertiary stuff. We are happy to stand for increased access to retraining. But secondly, how does that flow on to the broader community? Let's have a quick chat about diversification, because everyone wants a diversified economy. And we tell you regional communities also recognize the importance of diversification. That's why they send their children to universities. That's why people want to engage in different subsets of things. But the fact is that just there isn't a capacity to diversify. As I told you, the incomes in dairy are so great that there's no switch that could reasonably be made without massively ruining the lives of these individuals. We tell you there's no capacity to switch this kind of stuff. They told you that even if incomes are lower, diversification is good because it means we're more resistant to shocks in the economy. We tell you milk prices are not the kind of things that receive massive shocks across the world. We tell you that because New Zealand has such a significant market share, we're able to reasonably control the price as to ensure that our rural communities are better off. Additionally, we tell you that if we're in a situation where rural incomes are relatively high, but once in a while, sure, there might be a shock, we tell you the government is able to step in these instances and subsidize those incomes in the brief periods. We tell you that brief shock where the government has to step in is a better situation than if the government has to than if these incomes are just lower for everyone all the time. That's a trade-off we are willing to make in some circumstances. I'll take a POI now if there was one.
Hi, so do you realize that on your side of the house and the way you're claiming the benefits, that actually a lot of environmental harms will be occurring because of how gradual it is going to be to make farmers sustainable under your side?
Cool, moving on to that point of clash right now. That's great. So there are two parts of this idea of environmental stuff. First of all, they told us that New Zealand necessarily has to have an obligation to the farming community and that we must do things that are sustainable. We tell you that our role in the international community is to act as a body to do those unsustainable things just better. as we proved to you, it was never actually disputed, dairy demand is relatively inelastic under the side of the house. Culturally, people just tend to eat and drink the foods that they consumed as children. We tell you people are more reliant on those kinds of things. We don't see people switching to things like soy milk. Those are just always going to be more expensive. They are always not going to be wanted because they're seen as like lefty foods. They're not like their grandmother cooked for dinner. That means they don't have the health benefits. They're not going to want to switch. What does that mean under our side of the house? Because if they want to talk about dairy being noticeably unsustainable, we tell you at the point you shift dairy production offshore, that's just going to be massively worse. Because we tell you, while it's bad in New Zealand has the capacity to massively regulate. We have the political capital because people recognize that dairy is a massive part of the economy and thus want to ensure that it's clean and green because people can see dairy around them and also people like the environment in this country. That necessarily means when you shift that to a country like India, where there's like democratic impetus to have really good dairy production, you're going to have things like massive spillage of nitrates into waterways. You're not going to have the investment into science that you see in New Zealand. We tell you that even if it is equally bad, equally good in two countries, we tell you the concentration of dairy in New Zealand means you have a pooling of expertise in agri-science. For instance, Lincoln University leads the world in research surrounding how to make dairy production the most environmentally sustainable as possible. We tell you you'll never get those benefits at the point you spread dairy production around the world, you put it into conditions where there's no impetus. Briefly on international signalling, they told us this wasn't important. We think that's really important because it concedes the fact that New Zealand has no capacity to lobby those individuals that have no concerns about the environment. Trump isn't going to switch under their world. Their failure to engage in this means that this international mechanism just totally slips out of the debate. But now broadly onto long-term political ramifications. This is really crucial because we want climate policy to be something that's far more long-term. Two ways this works. First of all, we tell you massively switch off rural voters. We tell you that dairy is a massively important part to the culture of New Zealand. And even if we do not perceive it in this debate, we tell you a majority of New Zealanders, particularly rural New Zealanders, really care about the capacity to farm, the connection of that land, and that feeling that is an intrinsic part of being a Kiwi. All we do when we implement this policy is you turn off rural voters from mainstream politics, you turn them off from environmental policy. We reframe environmental policies in which is specifically going to ruin that part that is so culturally crucial to their lives, but also economically crucial to their lives, and turn them to parties like New Zealand First, parties like ACT, which are going to be far less likely to do things like mandate riparian planting, mandate those kinds of things that's really important in this debate. Secondarily, you turn people off from foreign policy because you tell you one of the key reasons people engage with New Zealand on the foreign scene is to get access to our massive amounts of dairy. Why is this so important into this debate? We tell you that if New Zealand loses this advantage and loses the capacity for countries to want to engage with it in trade deals, that it's not going to have access to things like international trade deals. That's really bad for our sectors in the economy, which rely on that free access to trade, but don't have the bargaining power to be able to go up to China and be like, hey, we've got something you want. At the end of this, we're better for individuals in rural areas, the environment, and urban communities. That's crucial. We win today's debate.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the third speaker of the affirmative team.
Sorry. I'd also like to take POIs verbally, so just as they're given. Thank you. No postcards. Not only is side neg today jeopardising New Zealand's economy and environment, they're also encouraging that New Zealand displays a show of complacency. Complacency about developing countries we owe care to, such as our Pacific neighbours. Disregard of New Zealand's image and the impact its actions could have on the international stage. And ultimately, an utter abandonment of our duty to our world and its future. Today, very proud to propose. I'll be asking two questions, and within these questions, I'll be talking about the economy basically continually. So firstly, how our model affects the environment, and secondly, how our model affects rural communities. So on the environment, I'll be splitting this into two sections. So firstly on the environment internationally, and then on New Zealand's local environment and the impacts that our model has on this. So essentially taking the
negating team at their best. They say that, you know, there will always be continual consumption of dairy, and basically less savoury overseas producers would simply expand production to fill this gap. And we actually just see this as an absolute non-response. And it's bold because it's bold of the team to say that they stand for the environment when this is actually not a solution. So we'd like to point out that the affirmative team provides no benefit for basically anyone environmentally, whereas as explained by our first and second speakers, the negating team provides local benefits and has the potential to instigate international change. So I'll speak about this on a local level firstly. So it's really important to note here that New Zealand's economy relies on basically a clean green image, because most of our one of our biggest international sectors, for example, is tourism, and we capitalize on this image both to get tourism and to get tourists into New Zealand, and also to sell our products. So it's absolutely to the benefit of New Zealand if at a local level we try to improve our environment. We think that the negating team is utterly disregarding the impact that dairy actually has locally. So not just on climate change, but the impact that dairy has on our local bush, and particularly on our now very, very polluted waterways. And basically their response to this was that we should actually let basically our image erode, and we should allow certain parts of New Zealand's natural beauty, which is really ironic when seeing as they talked about the cultural importance of certain aspects of New Zealand to New Zealanders. But anyway, let certain parts of New Zealand's nature erode in order so that farmers could see the negative impacts of dairy farming and therefore be more likely to want to change things. And we just absolutely think that this is not an appropriate response. On side affirming, we're actually suggesting something that can be done to change this before it gets worse. Now, secondly, on an international level, they snubbed our idea that basically signalling works, particularly as New Zealand is quite a small country. And they basically said that the environment would actually become worse because overseas producers would basically fill gaps that the New Zealand industry left. And we firstly would like to say that if they'd like to claim that that removing aspects of the New Zealand dairy industry doesn't actually affect the environment that much, then we can very, very equally claim that the gaps that the production of dairy in other countries that fills these gaps actually doesn't make a particularly big difference either. So this is taking them at their basis is absolutely a non-point. And then, but secondly, on to their discussion of basically Mia's analysis at first about how New Zealand actually has an onus and a responsibility to the rest of the country. And as a developing country that has the ability to do this, or to make some kind of difference, they absolutely disregard any kind of moral obligation to try and help the earth that we live in. And we think this is absolutely an issue. They also disregarded the idea that New Zealand is held to a high standard in any degree. And we think that this is not the case, particularly over the past few years. New Zealand has gained a particular reputation for being quite progressive, quite liberal, kind, and we think that New Zealand is actually a country that certain other world leaders actually look up to. And even if you just look at world leaders' treatment of the coronavirus, we can actually see lots of mirroring between Boris Johnson's treatment of how they changed their coronavirus policy that actually reflects the Labour government in New Zealand today. We think that they're disregarding New Zealand's influence on the rest of the world, and we also think that this is just, they can't claim to stand for the environment in any way when they're providing just no benefits on that, saying that New Zealand should actually just remain complacent and just not do anything at all. We think that this is absolutely unreasonable. We think that something needs to be instigated, and yes, New Zealand is a small country, but we have to do what we can do. And so that's where that point comes from, basically. On that, I'll move on to how I'll take a POI.
If it is true that New Zealand has a clean green image, why is it not true that they'll use that incentive to regulate to the best degree possible to protect those water prays, to protect the climate and protect the bush?
Because clearly that's not happening right now. Because if New Zealand's clean green incentive was valued by its locals, then this would already be happening. Changes would already be taking place. But this is not actually happening as we're seeing currently. And I'll actually talk about this at the end of my next question when I talk about some of the political ramifications that you brought up. So secondly, on how this model affects rural communities. So essentially the negating team is claiming that we negatively affect rural communities because we're removing their largest industry. So we're basically leaving them kind of up the creek without a vote. And we absolutely, this is not what we're saying. So we're simultaneously encouraging people to leave if they choose to. We're actually encouraging this through subsidies. So leave if they choose to and can pursue basically other areas. And we actually think it's important to note that farming communities are often kind of family businesses, and there's an expectation that you'll continue on that family business, considering that you own land. So in providing subsidies, we're actually opening up doors for a lot of people who we can't all assume want to continue on with that certain brand of farming or want to continue on with farming in general. So we're actually offering basically an alternative to those people, a really viable alternative, and also an alternative because as you said, if people do care about New Zealand's clean green image, in this case, then perhaps that's an alternative to make them feel like they're contributing to the environment. But we're also, but also as there's less supply in New Zealand's market of dairy products, as we said, and New Zealand has a really good reputation for quality dairy products overseas. There'll actually be greater demand, and we can kind of capitalize on that niche market to basically increase profit. So this actually really, so in conclusion, basically, we don't encourage a total shift from dairy, but we encourage a more balanced mix of industry. And this is actually quite effective rebuttal for another point that they brought out, which is basically that rural communities will be abandoned because young people will not invest in farming because it's been devalued so much, because there are now less dairy farms. And basically we actually see that the consequences of what we're doing, basically making New Zealand dairy farming a more niche market, will actually increase the value of New Zealand dairy farming and in the eyes of the public. And not only that will this retain basically the cultural prevalence that it has, and therefore kind of not alienating a lot of rural voters, as they stated. It actually means that this cultural ideology will still remain, but just at a more environmentally friendly level. For all reasons presented today, the moot must stand. Yeah.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the third negative speaker.
Wait, can you hear me? The affirmative side of the House today have been completely disconnected from all reality of what actually happens in the world, right? Because they've tried to tell us this, of this like amazing utopia where New Zealand has this great influence over society, that they're going to be able to signal to these far bigger countries to change their ways, and that chucking on a subsidy is going to fix all our problems and we're going to be able to successfully diversify an economy where we don't have enough industries that other global countries will actually buy from. Three main points of clash for you today. Firstly, which side better protects the global environment? Secondly, which side further aids New Zealand's economy? And then thirdly, does this cause political ramifications? So firstly, onto this point about which side better protects the global environment. So they told us that they better protect the global environment as they send a and the first thing they told us under this is that they send a global message and influence the global community. And recognize at this point, Madam Adjudicator, that they don't have much impact on climate change, and they said that themselves, that New Zealand itself can't have that much impact on climate change. So this point is absolutely key. So they're already minimizing their benefits there. But three responses. So firstly, we have zero leverage in the international community on this issue, right? Countries simply won't be bothered by New Zealand making a change, because the way you pressure countries into making a change and signal to other countries is when you give them an incentive to change their way or put like pressure on them. In this instance, we're only really affecting ourselves, and there is no reason for these other countries to like, you know, suddenly change their ways as well, because we are not pressuring them. Secondly, some world leaders have a very low priority on the environment. For example, like Trump, right? And that's like the leader of America, one of the biggest countries in the world. We don't think this signaling is going to be effective when someone like him doesn't even believe in climate change, right? Like, it's completely ridiculous to say we're going to have this influence. And thirdly, they tried to tell us that like, just because like everyone likes Jacinda and thinks she's nice, like all of a sudden like everyone's going to listen to us. Like, sure, like Jacinda has respect in the world, but that doesn't mean that countries like listen to us, right? We're a very small country. If that was the case, every country would have went into lockdown like we did and handled coronavirus in that way, but they didn't. So clearly we do not have that much influence. The other thing that they told us was that it simply improves the New Zealand environment. 4 main responses to this, because this is all they really had left on this environmental point. So firstly, we produce currently very sustainably in New Zealand. It's why New Zealand is known as a very environmentally friendly place. So we do have very sustainable practices currently, right? This is why we like currently, and they tried to tell us that we don't, but this is why we currently, you know, mandate riparian planting. We have an ETS, we have max cow per field numbers, and the government massively invests in science surrounding more sustainable practices. It is clear that we are sustainable currently. But secondly, we told you right from the offset and right down the line, we were very clear about this, that we support continued trend of implementing sustainable practices and like more like environmental laws and continuing to become more sustainable. This is a gradual change, right? But it is something that we can cope with because we are currently sustainable and we will continue to become more sustainable. But thirdly, in New Zealand, on their side of the house, there will now be more unsustainable practices, right? As the farmers will turn to the cheapest options in order to cover for their reduced profits, because most of the like really sustainable practices are like more expensive than the unsustainable ones, right? So when these farmers have less demand and are therefore making less profits, we think it is very likely that they turn to the more unsustainable options in order to cover for these reduced profits. That actually means that on their side of the house, they worsen the New Zealand environment. But fourthly, the global economy suffers, and that is far more important in today's debate, right? As countries will simply turn to other countries as alternatives to New Zealand for dairy due to us having higher prices, and these countries are far less sustainable than someone like New Zealand, who has constantly worked on being sustainable, right? We think this is countries like Brazil, which have terrible environmental regulations and therefore worsens the global economy, right? So at the end of this point, it is clear to see that we're the side that supports improving the global economy, while they want to stand on supporting just the New Zealand economy and having very limited influence, and they can't even get that because they simply do not help the New Zealand economy as explained. Now moving on to the second point of clash, which side further aids the New Zealand economy? So, sorry, I meant environment on that last one. Anyway, which side further aids the New Zealand economy? So they tried to tell us that they benefit by diversifying our economy, as New Zealand is currently in a vulnerable position. 3 main responses to this for you today. Note, Madam Adjudicator, firstly, that we didn't hear anything on what areas we could actually diversify into. Why is this? This is because this is huge when you realize there are no other sectors that New Zealand can diversify into, right? There's a reason that we haven't done diversification, because in most industries, New Zealand is significantly disadvantaged and won't get much demand, right? That's why farming is our, like, you know, dairy is our comparative advantage, and that is why we use it so much, right? But secondly, on this point, we think, as Millie told you very explicitly, and they didn't really respond to, that dairy prices do not change that much, and that New Zealand has a large enough market share to control this change in prices, and that if they do change, the government can simply step in to cover this for a temporary price change, right? We told you this very compelling bit of analysis, and we didn't hear any response to that. But thirdly, on this point, most people accept diversification as good, so why hasn't New Zealand done it? That's because it isn't feasible, Madam Adjudicator. Quinoa farms simply won't get the same demand as those dairy farms. They then tried to tell us that this allows for more like NZ products to be bought, as it improves our environmentally friendly image, and then also told us it allows for more tourism, right? So if our prices are like going up, then people simply won't care. And on this tourism point, they tried to tell us that they get improved tourism, but like firstly, we're already viewed as like environmentally friendly, and so this doesn't really affect it. But secondly, people don't travel to New Zealand just to see like a quinoa farm, right? We think they're like, a lot of the time they're going to cities anyway, And so we think that, like, sure, they want to see the nice views and the nice environment, which, like, they still will, because it's not like we're going to burn all the farms on our side of the house. So they still get this good environment. However, they still get this good environment. So we don't really think tourism changes at all. And this just proves that we on our side of the house do have an incentive to be clean, green, and environmentally good. So we then gave you much analysis about how this significantly harms and displaces rural communities, right? They tried to minimize this. So what did they say? So firstly, they said that they will be able to transfer skills. As Billy told you, and once again was not responded to, that this is not true, right? As dairy farming and quinoa farming are very different, and they're not actually very transferable skills, but also that there's not an abundance of jobs in these areas. And so they're not going to simply all be able to pour into these transferable sectors. This means they're going to have to not only change jobs into like completely different industries, but possibly relocate, right? Because farms are completely isolated from a lot of the rest of the jobs, right? So when they are forced to relocate, that means they're going to have to buy new housing and things of that nature. That is absolutely massive, because that accrues a very, very large cost, and they are displaced. But secondly, they claim that like they're going to chuck in the subsidy, right? Let's face reality here. This would be so expensive. There's loads of farmers in New Zealand. And when we already lost our biggest sector of production and lost a huge chunk of money coming into the NZ economy, this will cause huge, huge debt. And we simply don't have the money to fund this subsidy. So now quickly on the third point of clash, how does this affect the political sphere? So this was essentially Millie's split point and had absolutely no response. This is crucial because it means that, you know, we start to focus on like NZ first, right? And NZ first policies. And this means that we actually get a far less benefit, like our economy actually suffers because it's far less integrated globally, and therefore we suffer in that way. So at the end of today's debate, not only are we the side that actually focuses on the global environment instead of just New Zealand, we are the side that actually benefits our economy. Proud to be on the right side of this debate, proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech. As is traditional, now reverse the speaking order, so I'd like to invite up the negative reply speaker.
At the start of today's debate, side opposition told you that we could win on two fronts. First of all, we could win if we proved that we helped the environment. Secondly, we could win if we could help empower regional communities. I think we successfully did both today. I'm going to step you through in my reply why we win on both those burdens. Three things I'm going to talk about. First of all, the global environment. Second of all, the economy. And thirdly, briefly, political ramifications. Firstly, on the global environment, this argument played out crucially on two fronts. First of all was on the regional level, where at third, side proposition wanted to totally case shift to. I wasn't entirely sure why we should care about this point in today's debate. Why was that? In their best case scenario, all you're doing is shifting those regional harms in places like the Waikato to the exact same regional harms in places like India. We tell you that that's probably symmetric in their best case. But in their worst case, the case we were probably broadly more likely to accept, that was that what we had in New Zealand was a system of broad environmental regulations that sure weren't perfect right now, but because of political pressure to keep New Zealand clean and green, were getting better. That means those local environmental harms were far less in New Zealand than they would be in a country like India, would be in a country like Brazil. At the end of this, we prove that local benefits either don't matter or we get a marginal win on our side of the house. Second of all was a bit of debate about the international ramifications. First of all was this conception of a duty. We agree that New Zealand had a duty through this debate. We told you, however, that didn't look like taking necessarily action, but just doing the best thing in the case of the environment. We didn't have to stand for doing something if doing nothing was better. That means that their material, like us doing nothing for the environment, failing our duty, falls out. Then we brought on to this material about what was better for the environment, because they told us it was just important to reduce dairy because they thought it was really bad for the environment. We never really had any response to our really important material for this debate, which we thought was far more compelling. Material about the fact that people are just going to consume the exact same amount of dairy, so that dairy production is going to move offshore where it's equally bad. They then had a bit of a Hail Mary at third and told us this production was going to be equally bad. We tell you that even if production right now is bad, we say that the impetus from the green movement in New Zealand, where it is strong because you have the capacity to do so, to regulate will mean that we get gradual shifts in the right direction. At the end of this, the environment is probably going to be better, both regionally and internationally on our side of the house. But then moving on to the impacts on the economy, particularly on regional communities. A bulk of their case totally fell apart when we brought you the material that we were happy to stand behind regional trading opportunities. Crucially, under their side of the house, because everyone will be reliant on these, it will be really expensive. On their side of the house, where it's optional through schemes like the Provincial Growth Fund, we tell you it costs less, but also those individuals who can get access to training still get those accesses to training. We on both sides of the house get benefits surrounding things like regional opportunities and diversification. That didn't matter at the end of the debate because it was symmetric. Then crucially, what are we left with in this environmental point? Because we're left with this idea of forced diversification or optional over time gradual diversification. Why is that type of diversification far better for the economy? First of all, you protect wages and you protect jobs. We brought you down the line why dairy is going to totally collapse under their side of the house, but crucially, even if it doesn't, the alternatives people are going to be moving to are going to cost a whole lot more. Also, because if we break down in economies of scale, even if you stick with dairy, your income is just going to be way less. That's really bad for regional communities, as we told you, who are already incredibly vulnerable. But crucially, you also have harms accruing when people just aren't able to do what is in their best interest. You don't get to maximize New Zealand's comparative advantage. Then they had a bit of a Hail Mary about how this is going to ruin and cripple exports and tourism. We brought you in a POI where they just have an incentive to regulate better to ensure this. That wasn't responded to particularly well. We think we proved that why that didn't matter. But secondarily, we tell you that people aren't really making buying decisions based on this. We tell you New Zealand is just greener than anyone ever. Anyway, if the worst of the world is bad, they'll continue to buy from New Zealand. Then briefly on political ramifications. This was quite important in today's debate because we tell you that these ideas of climate change and if New Zealand's place in the world need to be sustained over time to ensure those better outcomes. First of all, on better global integration, they never really responded to our really important material about why New Zealand is going to be excluded from global trade deals. That's really bad because I'm going to talk about the industries that people are going to diversify into. Those industries won't be able to trade globally. Secondarily, you get more populist policy. That's really bad in today's debate because we don't want those leaders in our parliament. We want more stable, crucial leadership. That's important that we win today's debate.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the final speaker in today's debate.
Cool, thank you. It's incredibly demeaning for CNI to claim themselves as the saviours of the environment and the economy when they provide no exclusive benefits or even guaranteed benefits on their side of the house. Even in their case of their acclaimed regional training policy, there's no actual mechanism as to why this cannot exist under our side of the house and actually does through our subsidisation and actual implementation of agricultural policy that already exists on both sides of the house. 3 points of clash in the debate today. Firstly, the effect on rural communities, who benefits these better. Secondly, the economy. And thirdly, the environment. We think it's really important to say that at the start that we need this culling because of the immediate harms that it has on the environment due to the significant portion of the dairy herd and its impact. We've got a very through our several-year period which we're implementing, we're going to have concrete benefits, rather than this sort of optional incentive for farmers to buy into environmental practices because they've seen how bad the environment is and therefore they're going to reduce their sort of unsustainable practices. We think that's complete nonsense from CNI's side of the house. So let's look at our point of the clash on rural communities. So CNI came out and said that, look, we're damaging our rural communities, we're crippling them because of the huge importance that dairy has on our industry. Now, first of all, we think that it's really important that because of the huge importance dairy has in our industry, not only the damages it does for economy, as I explain later, but also how we're actually opening up more opportunities and doorways for a broader range of people within rural communities to be involved in different niche markets. We've told you that actually it is transferable with different areas of farming such as wool or even other niche markets such as Manuka honey, which isn't incredibly large in terms of startup costs. And even in terms of these startups costs, we've told you that we're providing this time and subsidization to be able to provide this sort of more easy transition. So we're actually getting this transferability to a greater ease and opening this up to a broader range of people in rural communities. And importantly, we're not actually destroying these rural communities either by supporting the national climate, which actually directly affects these communities as well. So we're providing sustainable economic practices for these rural communities opportunities while actually making sure that they still exist. Okay. Second point of clash, this being the economy. So we heard from CNI that it's the global economy is in jeopardy. And they stated also sort of against their case, they mentioned that New Zealand isn't a huge actor on the world stage as well, which we completely agree. And therefore we think that this huge exacerbation of climate change isn't actually going to really happen on their side of the house, because New Zealand's not small enough of a producer to mean that there's going to be huge more productions of dairy in other countries that's going to massively sway climate change production. We think that it's really important to notice that this sort of like unsustainable practice in international dairy industries happens on both sides of the house and is not an exclusive harm. Because what we're doing is we're making sure that we're providing, because we can't have such an influence on the global economy, we're actually making sure that we're signaling that this is able to be changed, and we're directly supporting our national economy by reducing the monopoly that dairy exports has, which is incredibly damaging in case of fluctuations. And we think, you know, this whole idea of subsidies for this fluctuations is like completely unmanageable and is actually going to be really unrealistic to work. And what we're doing is we're saying that people are going to we're supporting our economy through this diversification and also allowing people gradual ease and more of an importance through these material gains that we're getting with this. So lastly, let's look at the environment. And we think that it's really important to mention that they've really provided no analysis of exactly how the global environment would get worse. They just told us that we'd get different producers on the world stage. Whereas on our side of the house, we're getting more of a material benefits directly through New Zealand, through our climate change policy and action. We're actually making this and forcing this upon people rather than this optional environmental pathway that CNI produces. We're making this a concrete benefit, and we were the only side to do this. So proud to propose.